And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce Professor Thomas J. Sargent. Professor Sargent, a macroeconomist, joined New York University as the first W.R. Berkeley Professor in September 2002, a joint appointment by the Economics Department at NYU's Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Stern School of Business. He was awarded the 2011 Nobel Prize in Economics, shared with Princeton University's Christopher Sims for his empirical research on cause and effect in the macroeconomy. Professor Sargent was a professor of economics at the University of Minnesota from 1975 to 1987, and David Rockefeller Professor at the University of Chicago from 1992 to 1998, and the Donald Lucas Professor of Economics at Stanford University from 1998 to 2002. He's been a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution since 1987. Professor Sargent earned his PhD from Harvard University in 1968 and was a first lieutenant and captain in the US Army. He was a university medalist as Most Distinguished Scholar in the class of 1964 and won the Nemes Prize in Economics in 1997. Professor Sargent was elected a Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences and a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, both in 1983. Professor Sargent is past President of the Econometric Society, the American Economic Association, and the Society for Economic Dynamics. Among his books are Rational Expectations and Econometric Practice with Robert E. Lucas, Jr., University of Minnesota Press, 1981. The Big Problem of Small Change with Francois Velde, Princeton University Press, 2002. Recursive Macroeconomic Theory with Lars Lundqvist, MIT Press, 2004. And Robustness with Lars Peter Hansen, Princeton University Press, 2008. And today, Professor Sargent is going to talk to us about effects of opening borders. So please join me in welcoming Professor Thomas J. Sargent.
So thanks for your hospitality. I'd actually rather listen than talk, because I learn more when I listen. But here goes. So I'm going to talk about some basic ideas, some very old ideas, and then some new ideas and a little evidence from the United States about some possibly beneficial effects of opening borders. So, I'm going to be talking about barriers to trade, such as transportation costs, tariffs, and quotas. I regard all of them as barriers that inhibit trade across regions or countries. What's the slant I'm going to take is these various barriers to trade have the consequence of protecting local monopolies. Where local, I just mean confined to some region of some size. And then I'm going to talk about different kinds of inefficiencies associated with monopolies. And they're going to be actually two different kinds. One that's classical, and it was on Adam Smith's mind, and another that's newer, and I want to talk about the relative magnitudes of these different inefficiencies by bringing to bear just a little bit of evidence. Okay, so the policy issues that I'm going to be raising are, they're interrelated. They're about tariff policy, and antitrust policy, and policy for regulating unions, which in the United States is intimately related to antitrust policy. Okay, I think I'm pointing this. Oh, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to begin at the, actually not quite at the beginning, but with one of the patron saints of economics, Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, I have a friend who's a philosopher, and he tells me that Adam Smith was a philosopher, not an economist. He was a part-time economist. So he was a moral philosopher, and he wrote a famous book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. It was his first book. And then later he wrote another book that we like as economists called The Wealth of Nations. I'm going to quote from that. In both of those books, you'll find a description of something he calls the invisible hand. It's going to play a role in the argument I'm going to give. And what the invisible hand is, it's about unintended consequences. Unintended consequences. It's actually about good unintended consequences. Lots of times when we do something, there are unintended consequences, and some of them are bad and some of them are good. But Adam Smith was obsessed with the good ones. Okay. So here's what he means by the invisible hand. I need this to set the stage for what I want to talk about. So this is worth quoting. So he says, by directing that industry or your efforts in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, the individual intends only his own gain. He's purely greedy. And he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end that was no part of his intention. Nor is it always worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society more effectively than that he really intends to promote. Than when he really intends to promote it. And then he goes on to say, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities of life, but of their advantages. That's the magic of the invisible hand. But the magic has some qualifications, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And the qualifications are, well, in Adam Smith's vision, market prices send signals back and forth between producers and consumers. And prices are very important. The question is, who sets prices? So what Adam Smith wanted was no one sets them. No one has the power to set prices, that they're set instead by the invisible hand or a market. And things work well, according to Smith, when that's true. So the key force that Adam Smith alluded to was competition. He wanted the widest possible competition because he hated power. He hated market power. Okay. So, so competition in the invisible hand. The circle of ideas I'm going to talk about are competition and power, how power can be used or misused, how it relates to efficiency. And there's going to be different kinds of efficiency. There's going to be efficiency within firms and efficiency across the whole economy. That's going to play a role. And then monopoly is going to occur. Now, Adam Smith hated monopolies. He hated monopolies, and he thought monopolies were often created with the support of the government. And his whole book is about getting the government to stop helping monopolies. So Adam Smith hated monopolies, and he actually didn't like, he was a professor, he didn't like businessmen very well either. The whole point of the invisible hand is that even though businessmen are not moral, like his other book, The Moral Philosophy, They're not that way. They're not altruistic. They're greedy. Even though they are, if there are competitive forces and not monopoly, they'll do the right thing anyway because of unintended consequences of their actions through the market. But the big impediment to that was monopoly. So here's what Adam Smith says about businessmen. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. So that's the big threat. I'm going to describe some research about several industries in the United States in which this threat is going to be at the center. Oops. By the way, I welcome questions during my talk. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about the standard theory of monopoly. And this was what is in Adam Smith's head. And it's a theory that's developed. It's one of the triumphs of economics to fill in this theory and to show that many of that Adam Smith's insights were correct. So what does a monopolist do that's bad? What a monopolist tries to do is, because it has market power, it tries to raise its price. It does raise its price, and it reduces its output. So it produces less, moves up the demand curve, and raises the price. So that, in economics, usually, the reason it's so hard to give policy advice is things help some people and hurt other people. So when the monopolist raises its price and reduces output, that helps some people and hurts others. It helps the owners of the monopoly, maybe the shareholders or the family owners of a monopoly, but it harms consumers. It harms consumers throughout the whole economy in the following way. Too little is produced in the monopolized industry, where there should be more resources devoted, and too much is produced in other industries which are competitive. So there's a misallocation of resources across industries. That's why Adam Smith didn't like monopolies. And people like Walras and Marshall in the 19th century filled in many details about why this insight was right. And I should say Cournot. Okay. So what Adam Smith's about is, the whole book is about, or 3/4 of the book is about this. Some other time we could talk about what the other quarter of the book's about. It's about monetary economics. But 3/4 of the book is about Adam Smith deploring monopolies, giving evidence for them one after another. Lots of monopolies are being protected by restrictions on foreign trade. So his view was that many of these monopolies, when you looked at them, they were granted by the government or else protected by the government. And what he wanted to do is dismantle them. He wanted to dismantle them to get an industry the monopolistic industries to lower prices, produce more, and absorb resources from other industries. And he thought the whole book's an argument that that's going to be better. So that's his argument for free trade. Okay. So why did he think monopolies were bad? We're going to come to, so here's the idea. This is going to be the heart. Oops. Oh. Wait, excuse me, don't look at this. Okay, good. Okay. So now the question is, how costly are monopolies? So is Adam Smith talking about, so in theory, it's hard to disagree with Adam Smith. In theory, he made some if assumptions, and then he got a then. So that's a qualitative argument. So what about putting numbers on it? A famous economist in the United States tried to put numbers on this. He said, well, let's find out exactly how costly it is in the United States that some of the industries are monopolized. And what he estimated is that monopolies did impose costs, but they were positive, but they were surprisingly small. They were a small fraction of 1% of gross domestic product. So this was an astounding result about 60 years ago to this year. And think of its implications. Its implications are that the returns to antitrust policy are not very big. You rethink about how distorting tariffs are for protecting monopolies. So this is a very important piece of work. And when academics do research and come up with an astounding number like this, other academics come in to try to attack it. Largely, the quantitative magnitudes survived questioning. So many people led to conclude that despite the theoretical correctness of Adam Smith's opposition to monopoly, monopolies weren't really that damaging in terms of distorting resources. So now it's time to go and say, let's look at all of the ifs that were behind Adam Smith's Zen and see if he left anything out. And this is where I'm going. And so, so here's the idea. This is an important caveat, or a warning. Harberger's calculations assumed that monopolists allocated resources efficiently within firms. So within the firm, the monopolist is doing the right thing to maximize the value of the shareholders. So, you know, they're pushing costs down to the cost curve. They're allocating labor in the efficient way. They're hiring the right amounts of labor. If they're producing many goods, they're allocating resources across the sales of those goods in the right way. So they're optimizers. They're being very efficient. They're just, because they have market power, they're not doing something that's in the public interest, but they're doing something that's in the interest of their shareholders. Okay. So there's a famous economist who had this quip or joke that the benefits of monopoly are a quiet life. Mean that you're isolated from competition. Means that you don't have to be that efficient. You know, if a competitor isn't efficient, it goes out of business. But if a monopolist isn't efficient, because there's monopolist profits, he just gives up some of the monopoly profits. So what I'm going to talk about is a more recent line of work that builds on Hicks's conjecture and looks for evidence that monopolies promote inefficient allocations of resources inside the firm. And they cause a monopolized industry to operate much less efficiently than it would if it had market pressure. And this raises potential sources of quantitative costs of monopoly that go well beyond those that Harberger talked about. Okay. And it also raises the possibility that, well, maybe antitrust policy and free trade has efficiency benefits that would be bigger than the ones that Harberger estimated. So this is not my work. It's work by a number of people in the industrial organization literature. And one of my favorites is James Schmidt's, who's been a pioneer in this research. I'm going to tell you about it. Okay. So James Schmidt's at the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis. Here's his research idea. And it's based on a little bit of theory and a lot of data. So here's his idea, and a lot of common sense. What he's going to do, he's going to look on detailed studies of resource allegations inside firms in particular industries. So he's going to go live inside these firms, like. So he's going to contrast industry outcomes, and the three industries that he studied most are cement, iron ore, and sugar. Why iron ore? Because Jim Schmitz lives in Minnesota, and if you go to northern Minnesota, in the winter, it's very cold. It's pretty cold in the summer. They produce a lot of iron ore. They used to produce all the iron ore used in steel plants in the United States. So these three industries have the following features in common. They were, for a long time, each of them was a monopoly. And they were protected by something. They were protected either by high transportation costs or tariffs, or it doesn't really matter how they were protected. They were protected and they effectively had monopolies. Some of the monopolies were created by the government. I'll come back to that. Mandated by the government. So for a long time, 20 or 30 years, they're monopolies. And then what we can do, what Jim Schmitz does, is he observes how are resources allocated within the industry. That's what we're going to talk about. And then what happened is something happened when the monopolies were ended. Either tariffs or transportation costs or something in it to allow international competition. In all cases, it was the international competition in these three industries. So suddenly there were threats of competition. And then he's going to do a study of before, when they were monopolies, and after, when those monopoly protections vanished. And he wants to see what's going to happen to the efficiency of resource allocation within the firm. Is the firm going to look different? Because the Adam Smith or Harburger view would be, no, the firms were very efficient before, when they're monopolies. Why not? The monopolist wants to maximize its profits and the value of a shareholder, so it has every reason to be efficient. And then after, well, it's still going to be efficient, but it's going to its price is going to be lower, it's going to be producing more output. So Jim Schmitz wants to see if there's something else going on. Okay. So now, if you're an economic theorist, you'll see there's something very subtle going on here. You can kind of ask yourself, well, if you're a monopolist, why wouldn't you want to be efficient? And that's what Schmitz is challenging. So we'll come back to that. Okay. So the idea here is, actually goes back to a paper written by a Harvard economist named Harvey Liebenstein. And so his paper is all in words, but he has an insight. He says, he just asserted monopolists don't minimize costs. They do something else. And he gave a name. He called it X-efficiency, meaning inefficiency. He said, if you look at monopolized industries, they look like the U.S. Post Office or something. They're not maximizing profits and minimizing costs. And so this idea is taken by Gordon Tullock and Ann Kruger, my former colleague at Minnesota, in a famous paper. And the vision here is this: governments grant and protect monopolies. By the way, this goes back, this is going on in China and many other countries today, but it was going on in Britain in the early part when Britain started industrializing. There were monopolies all over the place. The Bank of England, the British East India Company, various grants in the United States. It was standard for the government to grant monopolies and to protect the monopolies. So then the idea is, once these are granted, people compete for those grants by lobbying. They're valuable. Somebody creates a monopoly, it creates some value, and the question is, who's going to get it? So there's a political process of trying to seek these monopoly profits. And this is the opposite of Adam Smith's invisible hand, because this is a socially wasteful but privately beneficial activity. So Ann Kruger called these rent-seeking activities. And they generate costs, and they're wasteful. They're what economists call deadweight loss. But they're just costs that are paid and nobody benefits from it. So the whole idea of Jim Schmitz and other young researchers has been to put numbers and many important details into exactly what these rent-seeking costs are and how they're dissipated. So the idea is that, key idea is that when people are competing for these rents, they're going to go after monopoly profits, but they're actually going to destroy some of the value of the monopoly. It's going to be a key idea. There's going to be efficiency lost in the pursuit of these rents. And so this is both a quantitatively interesting question. It's also theoretically interesting. That goes back to some. So exactly understanding why some of the value is being dissipated by the seeking of these rents is a first-class economic problem that goes back to the so-called coast conjecture, the coast conjecture. But you'll see that's going to be haunting this story a little bit. Okay, so Jim Schmitz's research strategy, he's going to focus on industries that at first were monopolized with tariffs or quotas, but that later saw those protections disappear. Before and after, he's going to watch what happens. He's going to estimate how much, if any, costs decrease and productivity rises after protection. And he's going to go inside the firm and ask exactly what's going on to generate those raised costs, or on the other hand, lower those costs after the industry opens up. So his idea is if monopolists don't minimize costs, you should see costs fall and productivity rise after the protection is removed. Shouldn't see any of that if the Adam Smith, Harberger view that monopolists are efficient go through. But we should see effects on labor productivity if Schmitz is right. So he's going to go get evidence on labor productivity. Okay, that's where we're going. So here's his three, now we can say in the United States these are former monopolies. Now they're not monopolies. Okay, one is U.S. sugar processing. It's interesting. This was made a cartel in 1934 under the New Deal, under something called the National Recovery Act. And then it was open to competition in 1934. And I'll just make a remark here. At the beginning, 100 years ago, not just in authoritarian countries like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, also in the United States, there was an idea that competition was bad, that it was wasteful, and that you had different industries. There was the idea there was lots of duplication, and there was also so-called cutthroat competition, that they were lowering prices, and the idea that low prices were somehow bad because they were lowering profits. So there's an idea that it goes across the whole world that the solution to this is cartels. So the Roosevelt administration, when it during the Great Depression came to power, one of the first things it did is it passed this law called the National Recovery Act, which mandated a couple things. One thing it mandated is that many industries would form cartels. They were forced to form cartels under government sponsorship, and the idea was that they would generate a monopoly profits there, and then that they would have to share these monopoly profits with labor unions. So this same act, this National Recovery Act, empowered unions. It reversed a bunch of court decisions that said unions were illegal combinations and restraint of trade, and said it countermanded those, and it said unions were legal, collective bargaining was legal, and they empowered unions, and they made a deal. This law made a deal that said that the industry could cartelize, but the deal was they had to recognize unions and let labor also cartelize. So that's the National Recovery Act. It was actually declared unconstitutional, but big parts of it survived. It's also the origin of a powerful labor union in the United States. So the U.S. sugar processing industry was one product, an enduring cartel that came from that. Another was U.S. iron ore manufacturing. And the story's different here. This was, in some sense, there's one place you could get a lot of iron ore in the United States. It's in northern Minnesota. It was a monopoly until the early 80s. And then what happened is, for various reasons associated with events abroad and transportation costs, a foreign threat came in. And it was Brazilian iron ore, which offered the potential of cutting costs to Chicago steel producers by 50%. And then the final one is U.S. cement manufacturing. That was effectively a monopoly until, or cartel until 1980. And there just weren't any imports. And then for various reasons, after 1980, there were a big surge of imports. So that's kind of the story of these before and after. So these are what Jim Schmidt, the industries he looks at. So let's see what happens. So here's the main ideas. So the key ideas, the central idea is that monopolies make room for rents. So to an economist, what's a rent? It's a payment to a factor of production, capital or labor, that exceeds what's needed to keep the factor of production in its present employment. Like for me, I'm a professor. I'm paid 10 times, 90% of what I make is rents, because I would do it for a tenth of the salary. So groups working for the second idea is groups working for the monopoly, namely employees, managers, and so on. They contest to divide those rents. That's Ann Kruger's rent-seeking thing. So some mechanism has to be made to divide those rents. Some arrangement or game. Now here's the key thing to Schmitz's idea. The mechanisms observed in practice typically tend to decrease the total amount of rents being able to be divided. And they do this by reducing productivity. So the idea is there's some potential rents out there. But the key idea is the arrangement for dividing those rents decreases the total pie. It's inefficient. So what are those? So here's where the data are going to have to come in and inform the theory that we're going to have to get to explain this. And this is a situation where the data are really ahead of the theory. So what did you observe? Union work rules. So this is one of the rent dividing activities. What's a union work rule? It's a rule that assigns tasks to various kinds of people and actually often specifies how big the group of workers who are going to be able to share these rents. So these are work rules. So I don't know if you have them in where you live, but I have them where I live in New York City. Work rules say that I'm a carpenter of a particular kind. I can do one task that I'm allowed to do. And if there's another task that I could also do, but it's not in the work rules, I can't do it. You have to hire another person to do that. So an example would be, I'm a carpenter. I need someone to hold my tool. There's a plumber who's sitting there, and he could do this. He could hold my tool because he's not doing anything. He can't do it. He's prohibited. So these are work rules that various union contracts negotiated with companies provided. These things harm the allocation of resources within the firm. They make allocation of resources within the firm less efficient. Something that Harvard and Adam Smith didn't take into account. So the idea is, so what are the sources of productivity? a monopoly that supplies labor. That union gathered strength. And the union established stringent work rules. And this caused labor productivity to fall. Low labor productivity so this cause and fall in labor productivity endured for a long time. Okay, so now what eventually happened when there's an industry that's inefficient is low labor productivity and consequent high costs eventually, and this took a long time, it created incentives for imports to threaten a monopoly. It took a long time, but eventually imports came. And after that happened, union power collapsed. Management bargained much harder with the unions. Work rules were relaxed, and domestic labor productivity increased to reach levels comparable to what labor productivity was with the threatened imports. That's the idea. So in terms of these, the cement union, just to give you some of the flavor of this work rules, so here's what the union said, the president of the Cement Workers Union. He says, no other industrial worker in the country can point to contracts that impinge on and restrict the rights of management as much as the cement contracts do. That's a claim. We know how to, we're going to distort the allocation of resources within the firm. It goes on to say is, so here's something part of the work contract. When the finished grind department is completely down for repairs, the company will not use repairmen assigned to the clinker handling department on repairs in the finished grind department. You cannot allocate, a worker's not a worker. You can't reassign them flexibly. Okay. Another one. Restrictions on your ability to terminate or introduce technical change. Employees will not be terminated by the company as a result of mechanization, automation, change in production methods, the installation of new or larger equipment, the combining or elimination of jobs. So there are very detailed restrictions on work rules, which management adhered to. Management agreed to this. So what eventually happened is there's no change in law, but there's a threat of and some imports coming in. And the consequences that when these imports come in, and this happens very fast, the union power essentially collapses in the early 1980s. Contracts are renegotiated. The restrictive work rules are dropped. And if you look at the data on labor productivity jumps in the cement industry after imports. So there's substantial reallocation of resources within the firm. So, you know, the title of my talk, Economic Effects of Open Borders. This is a potentially substantial one to provoke competition. It's the open borders are the same thing as a reduction in transportation costs, which allow resources to be reallocated across regions if you'll allow them. So again, so the nature of Smith's evidence is details about the impediments to resource allocation coming from work rules, and simultaneously measures of labor productivity in U.S. firms relative to other countries. And his evidence is quite, it's different kinds of evidence, but it hangs together. Then a couple of details about the United States that I'll just mention here. So when you say monopolies, U.S. law is complicated and ambivalent about this, because we have antitrust policy, But that coexists, so that antitrust policy is supposed to be pro-competitive anti-monopoly. But at the same time, we have some tariffs and we have quotas. Historically, we've had more and less. But those things are pro-monopoly. And then another big pro-monopoly thing is unions. Unions are immune from antitrust. They provide collective bargaining guarantees. And unions can be a way of getting monopolies through the back door. So why? Unions need monopolies for there exists to be rents to seek. So the relationship between antitrust policy and the empowerment of unions from a technical economic point of view is very interesting, both economically and in U.S. law. And the people that wrote the National Recovery Act under Roosevelt understood this. Okay. So other industries that Schmitz looks at. And the story's going to be, the details are going to be somewhat different, but the main outlines are going to look like the cement industry. So sugar, as I mentioned, that was a cartel. It's a government-mandated monopoly set up by the National Recovery Act in 1934. It survived to the 70s. It was, now this is interesting. Once you set up this cartel, you generated all these monopoly profits. It was supplemented by quotas that mandated how people within the cartel would share the profits. But these quotas, it turned out, were rigid, didn't adapt, and as time passed, they led to more and more inefficient allocations of resources within the cartel. That's another salient feature of this theory that Schmidt's using, that you need some mechanism for the rent-seeking activity to destroy some of the profits of the cartel. That's by leading to inefficiencies. Okay. So, so now finally, he goes through these industries. So after doing this and extracting some estimates industry by industry, Schmitz revisits the issues that were raised by Harberger. How big are the costs of monopoly? It's clear that qualitatively, having monopolists misallocate resources within the monopolies is going to raise the cost, but how much? So it turns out it raises them by several orders of magnitude. Instead of 1/13 of 1% of GDP, Schmitz has a preliminary calculation that says maybe it's 5% of GDP, which is a huge amount given these things. So this argument says that the rent-seeking and the consequent inefficient division of those rents leading to inefficient allocation of resources within the firm is a really important thing. So I'm ready to stop. So this is Schmitz's work is a refinement. It calls for further refinement of the original insight of Adam Smith and other people that said that trade, at least in certain types of goods, was a good thing, and it's a refinement in the sense that tariffs, quotas, and other devices that protect monopolies have damaging effects that go beyond those that worried Adam Smith. They lead to costly distortions within the monopolized industry. And so in the hands of Schmitz and others, there's evidence that opening borders can bring big gains by improving resource allocations, both within and across industries. Adam Smith was emphasizing only the across part, but there's big gains within industries. And in my opinion, that's an idea worth thinking about. That's all.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Sargent. My takeaway is, I don't know if any others had the same feeling, but there's another message for us here, because listening to what you had to say, customs administrations are monopolies, and trade has to deal with customs administrations, and very often, as we know, customs administrations don't minimise their costs. So to use your phraseology, certain mechanisms harm the efficiency of resource allocation within the firm. So for example, in customs, someone could say, well, I know that you've met the rules relating to this licence, but I can't issue this licence because it's not my job, it's done in another division. And so the cost of red tape, the cost of doing business with customs, can in fact lead to trade increases. So there's another twist on it as well. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. To be quite honest, I wish my lecturer in economics had been as succinct and as clear as yourself. I might have got a better mark, but that was really tremendous. We've got time for a couple of questions. Do we have any? Please.
Yeah. Do I do this? So I worked for monopolists once, the Department of Defense of the United States Army, and there were. I'll just say you see this kind of thing active very big time. Like there would be 2 ways to get soldiers or goods from point A to point B, or maybe 3 ways. One would cost 1/10 of the other, and often we did the high-cost one. So.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating subject. Might even inspire me to take up economics again, but then maybe not. Do we have any questions of Professor Sargent? Yes, please.
Thomas, my name's David Hesketh. I'm from Customs from the United Kingdom, which at the moment includes Scotland, which was the home of Adam Smith. Part of his Wealth of Nations, he really promoted the idea of not having regulation. He didn't like having all the rules that a lot of us had to abide by. And another part of his Wealth of Nations talked about the canons of taxation, which promoted the idea of tax being easy to pay and being equitable and so on. An interesting question for you. If Adam Smith was here standing at the podium, what do you think he would say about the World Trade Organization? And how do you think he would apply his canons of taxation to trade facilitation?
So I don't know. You know, even though it's a good question to think about. So here's the thing about Adam Smith. Okay, so if you go back and if you go read Adam Smith, it's a big book. Big part, I'll confess, big parts of it are really boring, and a lot of details about 18th century, especially British and French administrative things. But then there's pages that are have flashing insights that are surprisingly modern. And then what you wonder about him is, how is he doing it? How is he getting those flashing insights? Because he doesn't. You have to remember what he's writing. He's writing way before Darwin. He's writing. He doesn't know any. He doesn't evidently know any math. He doesn't know any statistics. So many of the things that we study in economics, he doesn't know what a demand curve is. He doesn't know what marginal cost is. But he's getting these right answers, or big parts of right answers. and exactly how he does that is, you know, I'm a person that likes equations and suspicious of intuition, but he's using, he has tremendous intuition. And I think one thing he does is he can spot a marginal condition really fast. He can spot an arbitrage opportunity. And anytime there's an arbitrage opportunity, he knows resources, like his ideas, resources are gonna flow to exploit it for good or ill. So I'm evading your question, but you know, he seemed to like he seemed to like simple and uniform regulations. He has a long section on how the government should raise revenues and whether it should borrow or and how it should borrow. He has definite views on it that predate and differ from some of, say, Ricardo's. So, if he were here today, I have a friend who's made a profession out of being the person who knew what Keynes would say if he were here, and he's pretty good at it. But I don't think I'd be any good at telling you what Smith would say.
Thanks very much. Any other questions?
Yeah. Here.
Please.
Can I? Professor Sargent, thank you so much for his excellent lecture on this theme. I just do two brief comments, and I would like you to comment on those, please. First, you mentioned Adam Smith, and in your lecture, I guess we also could mention David Ricardo's and his concept of comparative advantage. In other words, tariffs are bad not just because they protect monopolies, but also because they impede comparative advantage to take place. You mentioned the case of iron ore, and in Brazil, the large tariffs would also back then would impede the Brazilian cheaper iron ore to come into US and other markets, because in that sense it would impede Brazil's comparative advantage to take place. And the second point is that on the effects of opening borders, there is today a large literature of quantitative models, of econometric models that in fact try to measure those effects of opening borders. They use the so-called gravity model, which tries to explain trade in terms of GDP, distance, tariffs, quotas, and other variables. Now, what we do is we use qualitative variables to measure those effects. Indeed, myself and Professor Morini are presenting an article tomorrow that try to measure the effects of AEO programs and single-window programs in 75 countries using very recent data, and we find that AEO and the countries that adopt AEO and single-window programs, they tend to trade more than the other countries within this 75 countries measure. So if you could comment on this, I pretty much appreciate. I'm from the Federal University of São Paulo in Brazil. Thank you.
So I guess working backwards, I'll be interested in studying your paper, which I haven't yet, but I think quantitative studies like the ones you describe are really important in striving to measure things. I was remiss in not mentioning David Ricardo and the comparative advantage. The interesting thing is that Schmitz and Ann Krieger are adding something on top of David Ricardo. And they're both important. and trying to get a handle on both of them. I want to mention a book I've been reading that I advocate that's related. It's called Fragile by Design. It's actually about, I mentioned that Adam Smith, his book, there's a part of Adam Smith's book that they actually don't like at the University of Chicago, which is about banking, and it's advocacy of actually Scotch banking system to spread the kind of free banking system that Scotland had at the time Smith was writing to the rest of England. So this book is called Fragile by Design. It's written by Charles Calomiris and Steve Haber of Stanford. And what it is, it's about the interaction between political systems and rent-seeking and the nature of the banking systems that are observed in a country. And the reason I mention it is the politics of some countries, like my own, are set up to have produced a banking system which is fragile and prone to periodic crises. And while the politics of some other countries, such as Canada, which lives right next door to us, sets up a banking system which is very stable. Canada doesn't have crises. And actually, if you extend this to Latin America, countries like, Chile didn't have a problem in 2008. What Calomiris and Haber do is they extend this insight about rent-seeking and sharing to actually the political structures that give rise to situations that generate this activity and outcomes for the financial system. So their book's really insightful and a little distressing, actually, in terms of what's going on in my country.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Sargent. I found that fascinating, to be honest, and we all deal with issues relating to tariffs, quotas, other issues, including non-tariff barriers, but it's good to sometimes take that step back and think, why do these things have the impact that they do? And it sometimes takes a presentation like that to make us realise that there is a lot of economics behind what we do. And I still like the issue about the monopolies and the mechanisms which cause inefficiencies, and comes back to a discussion I was having with Assistant Secretary Burson just over lunch. Just imagine the inefficiencies that may occur with the total absence of coordinated border management without single windows, which a lot of countries have at the moment. So it's great food for thought, and I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did, and please join me in thanking Professor Thomas Sargent.